Okay, welcome. This is, sorry, I have to check because, and I even left my glasses, because I'm running from session to session. From Dissonance to Harmony, Data Standards and the Future of On-Demand Transportation. And let me introduce my great panel. Immediately to my right is Jana Lynott. She's the Senior Policy Advisor with AARP Public Policy Institute. She's published a lot of research related to the future of mobility. She coined the term universal mobility as a service, right, to emphasize the need to design mass systems to connect everyone in the community, including older adults and people with disabilities. And she's passionate about the role data standards play in creating more equitable transportation. She's a member of the SUMC board. Roger Teal is one of the foremost experts in demand-responsive transportation, having led numerous research studies, including the 2020 TCRP study on the you can hear me without the mic, right? I need to hold the mic? I need to hold the mic. All right. No, I'm getting...
It's better for some.
I'm going to keep it down here. Does that still work? Turn it. I'm going to hold it. There you go. We've come to a consensus.
Hold it, don't drop it.
There you go. I will at the end, though. So Roger Teal, the 2020 TCRP study on the development of transactional data specifications for demand-responsive transportation. Dr. Teal has managed many large software projects, including Mobility DR, which is a technology platform for DRT. He is the founder and principal of DemandTrans Solutions. Kevin Chambers is the principal of Full Path Technology. If you were in the plenary earlier, he was on it. And he's dedicated to, since 2000, dedicated to assisting public agencies and nonprofits in assuring that their technology investments serve their organizational missions. Which, does your technology serve your organizational mission? That's a really good question for transit agencies and DOTs. From 2010 to 2017, he led technology innovation at Ride Connection in Portland. It was the area leader in providing mobility options to older adults and people with disabilities. He now consults as the principal of Full Path Transit Technology, focusing on technology at the intersection of mobility, human services, and health care. Why am I jumping? Because I'm going down here. Al, I lost my introduction.
You know me, Benji.
You can just introduce
Who
me.
is this Al? Al is the director of learning and research.
Yeah,
Something like
learning and research. Yeah,
at the Shared Use Mobility Center. I have his introduction somewhere in here, and it seems to have disappeared because I pasted something onto it. But
well, this is better. I get to hear what you think.
he leads our work. He leads our work on Federal Transit Administration, particularly for the Mobility Learning Center, which if you don't know about, go visit it. Learning at sharedusemobilitycenter.org. It's an extraordinary resource of case studies and all the best knowledge on how shared mobility works and how innovation works. He, I think, has the longest tenure in SUMC.
Yeah.
Yeah, was there even as it transitioned out of CNT. So I'm going to, because I work with him, then he can get mad at me later. I don't have his full introduction. That's our panel. And let me.
You can hand it to Al.
There you go. Well, I'm going to hand it to Al, and then we're going to go. I welcome the attendees. Al is going to give us a short background on DRT, Demand Responsive Transit Data Spec.
Yeah. Well,
you got it.
Oh, yeah, okay. So, just a minute. I'll keep this short, but on the working group that Jana and I co-lead, the DRT Data Specifications Working Group, in 2020, we held a virtual session. It was supposed to be in person, but it was virtual, and on the transactional data specification, what we're going to be talking about today. And from that virtual workshop, there was apparent, and there was a need from the people who attended it that they'd love to have a space to share lessons learned, talk through issues and challenges, and collectively work through solutions. And it started with 10 agencies. in summer of 2020. We quickly expanded to involve the private sector. There's now over 60 plus active participants, and I think that reflects just the interest in this across the country. People want to know how to use data specifications, and more importantly, create that interoperable system. And so it's just been fun to work with colleagues here and just to really watch it grow. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jana.
All right, well, great. And I just want to reiterate what Al said, is that I've been learning a tremendous amount from the working group, and I'm really excited that we can share some of those insights with a broader audience today. So AARP sponsored this workshop because we really believe that the creation of a more equitable and convenient transportation system depends on bringing the right technology to the table, as well as making those institutional commitments to putting that technology into place. And I really believe that data standardization is an important component of our ability to achieve these bigger goals of mobility that we're working toward. So my time today is just to spend a few short minutes framing up our discussion, and also trying to level the playing field, because there may be folks who are somewhat new to what it is that we're talking about. And I also suspect that there's people in the room who may think they know what they're talking about with transactional data specifications, and may not really understand the bigger picture of how do you incorporate services like those for people with disabilities, older adults, and all of that into this conversation. So when it comes to mobility, it's as if we have a two-class transportation system. And we have a system where we have very competent transportation planners who are looking out for the needs of people like me, who really have very few limitations for accessing roads, public transportation systems, bike and scooter share, et cetera. And then those planners turn to human services professionals to try to fill in the gaps for others in the community. And what this has created is a two-class system where, for folks like me and living in cities, we may only have to wait 5 minutes for the next bus or train or ride-hailing vehicle, whereas people who are dependent on more specialized services may have to schedule that trip 48 to 72 hours in advance. My state of Virginia, Medicaid, requires a 5-day advance reservation to schedule a trip. We also know that in any given metropolitan area in the United States, there may be dozens of community transportation providers, but because they're not coordinated, the service of any one may stop at the county boundary, and the service that the customer receives is really inadequate. So it's looking at how do we build a better system. Now, Benji mentioned mobility as a service, and I like to emphasize universal mobility as a service, needing to serve everyone in the community. So what this really entails, it's one-stop shopping for public transportation, ride-hailing, microtransit, biker scooter, share hourly car rentals, and importantly, ADA paratransit, Medicaid non-emergency medical transportation, even rides with volunteer drivers. And then trying to seamlessly connect all of those services into a common whole and to cover the entire trip. And then the payment systems on the back end are smart enough so that if there is a subsidy that needs to be applied, it's able to do that for the customer. So gone are the days when the Medicaid customer would not be allowed to stop off at the grocery store on the way home from a doctor's appointment because Medicaid won't cover that portion of the trip. And so really how we go about creating these networks will determine the cost of travel, the availability of travel options, and ultimately how equitable and convenient our system is. And that's where open and universal data standards comes into play. So what are data standards and their precursors, data specifications? Well, they're nothing more than a standardized way to present information about the trip in order to facilitate data sharing and coordination among providers. They include the fields of data, the format those fields are to take, and then the order of operations in terms of what action needs to be taken in what order based on the information that's being passed in these electronic messages. In terms of our transportation system, the thing that we need to primarily keep in mind are we have these two types of transportation data that needs to be shared. We have discovery data, and then we have transactional data. So the GTFS, General Transit Feed Specification, is really our industry's kind of model set of data specifications for discovery data. It allows the customer to find information about the available options. And I would assume that everyone has probably looked on their smartphones to look up the next bus or train to get to a particular destination. And all of that is kind of being powered by that GTFS system. And there's now more than 500 transit agencies in the United States that have put their route and schedule information into this format and have made it available to third-party app developers such as Google, Transit, and others so that they can offer that information to the customer. But that's really just phase one of information sharing. So GTFS, it describes fixed route and fixed schedules. And that's a problem when about half of our transit service in the United States is delivered through demand responsive and on-demand services. And so there's ongoing efforts, multiple, to build extensions to the GTFS to build in that capability to offer the customer information about those more flexible services. But whether we're talking about GTFS, static, real-time, flex, eligibilities, capabilities, or even on demand, we're still in this universe of discovery data. So that's not enough if you're a customer that needs more specialized service. You have to have the provider of service be able to make a transaction with the customer. So the trip needs to be scheduled. A driver and vehicle dispatched, confirmation messages sent back to show that that trip has been delivered. You need to have a fare paid, you need to have a subsidy applied, and you need to have a report generated that can be shared with the funding agency. And all of this is much more complex than the GTFS specifications. And that's why we need transactional data. So one of the very positive progressions in our sector that happened just prior to the pandemic was the release by TRB of Report 210, the transactional data specifications for demand responsive transportation. And that, essentially, the benefits of that, it allows the coordination of trips among many of these demand-responsive providers in the community. So when there's a capacity constraint of one provider, another provider in the system is able to step in and offer a seat to that first provider's customer. It means less staff time dedicated to manually coordinating and scheduling trips among different providers, results in fewer empty seats and lower cost per passenger, more accurate billing, financial savings arising for greater efficiency and productivity, and most importantly, better service for the customer in terms of same-day service and more reliable and punctual transportation. So some of you may be asking, what's different about this transactional data specification from how communities have done this level of coordination in the past? Well, this level of coordination is very rare in the United States, and typically it's been done through proprietary application programming interfaces called APIs. Often companies call their APIs open APIs, but it's somewhat of a misnomer because those open APIs, the company is really controlling the keys to that system. And so each provider in the network has to program their software to be compatible with each provider's software's APIs. And so if one provider makes a software change, then each of the others have to update and upgrade their software in order to stay interoperable within the system. And so it's a really expensive and brittle proposition for interoperability. Conversely, the transactional data specifications allow, really we could refer to these as open and universal API. And they, with this, providers really only need to design their scheduling software to be compatible with that set of data specifications. And then if one of the providers in the systems makes an update and that update is compatible with the TDS, those other providers don't need to take any action. So it's a better way, more cost effective, and it also will allow us to scale up and provide more coordination across more communities. So the data specifications, TDS, was modeled upon a data standard that has been in operation in Scandinavia for 20 years, most prominently in Denmark. And I don't have time to go into all of the details on this slide, but I do want to share a video that we put together back in late 2018. I led a study tour to Denmark to study the Flex Denmark system. I managed to get funding to bring a video crew, so we shot a couple of videos, and one of those I want to share with you before we transition to our panel discussion.
Transportation in Denmark is all about options. Cutting-edge technology connects riders to a myriad of ways to get around. And everyone benefits, no matter what age.
Denmark is a country with 5 million residents. We are an aging population.
Danish law requires transportation services be provided to all citizens who are disabled and to those needing a ride to the hospital.
Because of the elderly population growing, these kinds of services are in high demand.
In the rural areas, where a large percentage of older Danes reside, cost-effective transportation is a necessity. Fixed bus routes on a regular schedule are far too costly to maintain.
What we've seen in many years in Denmark is there will be bus services in many rural areas. Those services are simply, over time, too expensive. Bottom line, there was a lot of air in those buses and too few bumps on the seat.
That was actually one of the starting points. How could you make good mobility services in the countryside without making bus routes? It's not about the line or the route that we're going to take you.
Okay, then I'll say.
It's about you as a customer getting the mobility service at the time and at the price and at the quality you need.
One of the reasons to try and see if we could get a more both customer-friendly setup but also a more economical setup was to try a demand responsive service out in those regions, giving the customer a better service, but also the municipals and the regions a better use of their money. So that challenge we've tried to solve with Flex Denmark, which has been a tremendous success.
Flex Denmark is an IT company managed by the public transit authorities. It provides demand-responsive services to Denmark's 5 regions and municipalities. Here, vehicles do not follow a fixed route. Instead, they pick up and drop off riders at the requested address.
Flex Denmark makes sure that the cars are at the right place at the right time and operate in as efficient a manner as possible. Essentially a big algorithm dispatching cars.
These kinds of services are very important in order for elderly people living active lives, being able to take care of themselves for longer parts of their lives. In that sense, Elderly people are not different from other people. Flextrafik can also be used by the younger generation. Living in a rural area, kids need to go to football, to the riding school, or come back home late from a friend's house. So it's good for all kinds of people.
Flex Denmark supports competition within the private sector. The platform connects more than 550 private transportation providers into this single integrated system, providing nearly 6 million trips per year.
We do not own any taxis. We tender the whole business. Private operators are doing the operations for us.
The platform accurately calculates these fares and then automatically applies them to various government cost centers for proper payment. Jens Peter Landberg and Niels Erbo have been with Flex Denmark since the beginning.
When I started together with Niels 20 years ago, we had 5 cars. Nobody believed this coordination between a lot of cars, a lot of payers, a lot of customers using the system was possible. Now we have around 1,700 cars in contract.
While Flex Denmark provides the IT to make the system work, Flextrafik is the brand name for the 5 services offered. These include Flex Patient, Flex Handicap, Flex Municipality, Flex Route, and Flex Tour. These 5 services use the same vehicles to get riders to a variety of destinations. A customer going to a medical appointment may share a ride with someone going to the gym, to school, or to the hairdresser.
Flex Tour, that is special. They pick you up at your address and drive you where you want to go. It's not a taxi. You can meet some people who go to the hospital, and you can meet some people who go to some medical care, but you don't know who you'll travel with.
It's a story about cooperation and also about solving problems.
That's why Denmark recognizes access to transportation as a critical component of healthcare. For example, Flex Patient, funded by the government, connects riders from less populated areas to major hospitals, providing Danish citizens with access to quality care.
It is much cheaper to transport people than it is to give them a bed in the hospital for the night.
We have a lot of customers coming into the hospital. These customers, we take them with small vehicles to the bus and drive them to the central hospital in Copenhagen. There is some medical person on board, and then the small buses bring them right to their home.
AARP has been looking at the Flex Denmark model because we understand that transportation can be a huge challenge for millions here in the United States. The Danes have been especially successful because they agreed 20 years ago that they would use a common data format to share all of the trip data. It basically creates a very integrated system that opens up a lot more possibilities for convenient service. On a per-trip cost, it's really no more than what we're spending here. If we apply this technology, we're going to see a great improvement in what we have to offer here in the US.
It's transportation from your own door, and that is very important.
It works every day. It's a lovely way to be transported.
Such high technology. But thank you so much, Jana and Jan, on telling us more about it. But I'm going to turn to Roger, who knows a lot more about Flex Denmark. And tell us more about, there was a number I picked up, 500 transportation providers? 550. 550. More than. How many have you ever tried working with in your municipality? Maybe 2? 3? So you're right up there. 550. How does it enable this?
Right.
And is it feasible?
Right. So at first, it's a little hard to get your mind around what they've done in Denmark. This one. When I was first exposed to it, which was 8 years ago, it was like, oh my God, these people have pulled something off that's remarkable, which they have. But they don't consider it particularly remarkable because they just built on the building blocks of what was already in the society, which was funding programs, service providers, vehicles, funders, and travelers. And by the use of these data standards, it's called SUTI, S-U-T-I, it's an acronym, which was created in the mid-1990s by the government in Sweden because they didn't want service providers to lock in the cities or counties, municipalities that were providing the funding for transportation. So they created this essentially transactional data standard, which quickly spread to all of the Nordic countries. So Denmark used this as a fundamental building block to put together this program. So there's about 800 agencies, payers, organizers of the service for their clients. Many of these are municipalities. They're a funder. They could be human service, many, many senior programs, healthcare organizations, and then hospitals, sort of a subcategory of healthcare organizations. There's 550 service providers. The guy from Flex Denmark said 1,700 vehicles. That's how many vehicles they use in one day. There's 4,500 vehicles in the fleet of these 500 service providers. And there's one computer system that schedules the vehicles, and it's sort of, they almost do it a bit like a TNC. Many of these service providers are taxi companies. Remember, a lot of this service is outside of the big cities, so you don't have organizations out there, that are big service providers. So a lot of taxi companies, small school bus companies, and basically every transportation provider of human beings in Denmark wants to be part of this because there's a lot of money associated with it. So they've acquired the technology themselves. The government didn't pay for these service providers to acquire the technology that enables their scheduling, dispatching, whatever system to interoperate, keyword, interoperate with the Flex Denmark reservation and scheduling system. Now you might say, well, who does all the reservations? There's these hundreds of agencies have reservations terminals in their office. So I can call up my local agency and they take my information. And there's a new generation system they're working on right now so that people will be able to use apps and their own computer to schedule their own rides if they're already, an eligible person for this funding source. And those trips go into the central Flex Denmark database, and their scheduling engine picks up the piece of data and says, okay, this person's going from A to B. Who are service providers in this area? What trips have I already put on given these service providers? And it sends out a request to one of these service providers, and it gives them 30 seconds for their computer system to accept or reject the trip. If it accepts, then that trip is booked. The information that the customer needs goes back to the booking system. If they reject, it goes to the next service provider in line. There are days when they schedule between 15 and 20,000 trips a day. So wrap your head around that. This is real, and it's been real for a long time, like 8, 9, 10 years at this level, all because we have transactional data specifications.
Can I clarify something? And I know
Yes.
you have a press. 550 operators, 4,500 vehicles. Was that right?
Correct.
So they're also very small fleets.
They're small
Right.
fleets.
Yeah, 4 to 5 fleets, right?
Often very small. They might only have 2 or 3. Remember, if a small community, we don't have this anymore in our society. If I could take you back 40 years in time to the Midwest, you would go to these many small towns, 15, 20, 25,000 people. You'd find a small taxi company with a half a dozen vehicles. But when public transit became subsidized, they didn't take advantage of building on these organizations. In a couple states, Wisconsin's a great example, they did. But most places, public transportation subsidies meant that these folks eventually left the market.
So you're telling me to either move to Denmark or go back in time, is that?
Right. So this is the model, not because we want to replicate Denmark, but because it shows you what's possible when systems can interoperate that different organizations use. There's nothing remarkably creative about this. How many of you use Orbitz or Expedia to book a flight? Probably a lot of you, right? Suppose that all that Orbitz and Expedia did was tell you what the schedule is between Chicago and, say, New York. Oh, I could go on American at these times of the day, I could go United, but you can't book a flight. All it tells you is the schedule. This is the state of the art in data for demand responsive transportation today in the United States. I can show you a schedule. Oh, here's a demand responsive service. What can you do with it? Literally nothing. And this is where the transactional component, what Jana was referring to, because after you see the schedule, I want this flight, I want to book this flight, then it shows me, if I'm like a United member, it shows me what seats are available, I have different pricing options, I can transact, and then when I'm done, I get information back about my transaction. We don't do that in public transportation.
All right. So I've got notes here that you're going to tell us about the Denver Flex ride system. Because my question was, is it?
No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put it here. Go back
Okay.
up.
Actually, I'm wondering if we want to mix it up a little bit.
Sure.
Just because I'm looking at the time,
Yeah.
and we want to have, 45 minutes for our
For a workshop.
workshop too. So.
Yep. Yeah, I don't need to say anything more about this.
Okay. So
I just want to deliver the message that this is what we're talking about. Making something like this possible. That it's not impossible, it's business as usual, and has been for a decade in another country that's not really any smarter than us.
So I'm going to turn over to Kevin because I think he has an example like that. And it's very interesting, your example of airline reservations, because there's a deep history there of a standard that the U.S. government paid for that was pushed on them by, I think, I said Pan American Airlines, or was it American Airlines? Really interesting history, but that's a side conversation. But research it. Kevin, tell us about, basic things that we could build up into this. Something like, we see it working, and then we wonder where we are, but can we get there? Give me an example.
Well, I came into transit from nonprofit database management in 2010, and I took a training with a colleague, some of you may know, Carol Schweiger, back then about 2010, 2011, and I'm like, okay, I'm here. I'm ready to do some really cool things around technology. So what are the standards available to me so I can start doing these things? Because I was working at Ride Connection, which coordinates 30-odd nonprofit transportation providers in the Portland metro area. And she's like, actually, there aren't any. I'm like, what? So I've been working basically since that time of like, well, let's see what we can do to fix it. And we've found common cause here with Roger and Jana and so many others to start building that out. So let's talk a couple projects. So one of them, this is kind of a model for, I think, what this can look like in terms of the different contexts. So this is something that comes pretty close to what is being reached for in the greater Puget Sound area. So there is the jargon term we're using for this point is a one-call, one-click system that is, it is the discovery. That's, plan, book, pay, right? In this case, the pay is later on, but plan and book, right? So being able to discover all the services, not just fixed route services, but also demand responsive services, also eligibility constrained services, and be able to have all those be visible in a digital system. And then from that, once you discover those services, being actually able to book and say, well, I want that one. And so you can see there's some ones that are clear and that we've already got, you know, the ability to make those bookings within the context of an app. You know, so we've got Uber, we've got Lyft, we've got taxis, all the new mobility options. But what we want to be adding in also is these community service options, right? So it's also possible to bring in sound generations or, you know, any of, or, you know, HopeLink's services that they operate directly or with King County Metro, what have you, have all those be options. And without necessarily needing the rider to even necessarily know which one they want, that they don't have to become suddenly a domain expert in half a dozen or more transactions. They can say, I'm here, I'm this person, I'm a veteran, I'm 68, and I use a walker, and I need to go to the VA. Just figure it out for me. Don't make me become an expert in this. And so that's the vision of this. And this is really, if we want to do that at scale, at the level of transactions that Roger's talking about, we need to be to use a technology together with a social construct of standards, right? And so that's what this is really about. So this is one thing that is being worked on. This is early. We're really on the discovery stage now. With HopeLink and the greater Puget Sound area. But this is piece one. Let me talk about another one that is also in there. There we go. So RideSheet. So RideSheet is about as sexy as it gets in technology because it's a spreadsheet. And remember, I don't know who were at the plenary where I talked about having an office of extraordinary spreadsheets. Like, I seriously want that. So RideSheet is something that I made after working with numerous really small rural transportation providers who were still on index cards, still on whiteboards, using Outlook, using Excel, and they asked me point blank, like, can't you just make something like this for us that's like Excel that just is just, but helps us figure out what we need to do and organizes us a bit? I'm like, well, why can't I? Like, why do I have to? Why aren't we doing something like that? So that was the idea of RideSheet. This is supported by AARP. They funded this grant program for Lake County, Oregon, which is in south central Oregon, borders both Nevada and California. It covers the square mileage of Massachusetts with a population of 8,000 people. So we are talking not just rural, but highly rural or frontier. And what was needed was not something fancy. It was something to get them being able to use technology at all with the level of readiness that they had, with the staffing they had, and with the knowledge that the capacity within the staffing they had. And really, at this point, and there's hundreds of places across the country that are like this, that technology, and I will advocate for it, should be something as simple as a spreadsheet. So RideSheet is basically a specially designed spreadsheet in Google Sheets. So it's online, through a browser, real-time sharing, in the cloud, with the ability to reach out and get external APIs. So we use that for contacting Google Maps, for kind of making it easier to understand distances and time estimates and such. But we also are using it for coordination, using the transactional data specification that Roger developed in this TCRP report 210. So we're using a subset of it, not the entire thing, but we're using a subset of it so we can get multiple RideSheet instances talking to one another, so they can't just, this is kind of the amazing thing about Google Sheets, is you can not only just go out and reach out for public data like the Google Maps API, but you could also be an endpoint for other things reaching in, and basically with authentication and security, actually be able to say, hey, do you have any rides that you need to have fulfilled? Well, yes, I do actually. Here they are. So this is not the kind of automated Denmark thing. This is replacing a phone call, an email, or a fax, right? Like you say, I want to share this trip so that this other agency can see it, and then they get they can get a text or email and they can look at it and go, oh, can I take that person to the hospital in Bend? Let me look. Yes, I can. I go in there. I go into the spreadsheet. Say yes, I can do it, and then all the information is shared very quickly, and it's still, there's a lot of manual elements to it, but it is lowering the friction to that manual coordination. So that's what RideSheet is, and it really wouldn't be possible to scale that out beyond RideSheet unless we had the standards. So it doesn't just have to be RideSheet to RideSheet. It can be RideSheet to another system because we're using standardized data formats.
I'm going to turn to Al because we are also working in a project in Atlanta with the Atlanta Regional Commission that is using the same API. Tell us about it.
Well, we're not quite using it, but and in part, because we've encountered some, initial obstacles or challenges that we've been working through as a project team, and collective, so for example, CPACS, the Center for Pan-Asian Community Services, is a small community-based, highly community-focused transit agency, and they operate within one county, and we look to partner with a neighboring county, and what we realized, and Spare here, Tanvir is joining us, the technology was not the issue, but on that level, just the eligibility criteria, the service models were different enough that made that coordination, not practical at this time at least. And so I think I think choice and options within that network could then help with that situation. But we've actually stepped back a little bit, and we've been working with the Atlanta Regional Commission to form a microtransit regional working group. And there's hopes to expand that statewide, but it provides that space to, first of all, learn what other agencies are doing in the region, and hopefully within the state, but then look for opportunities for that coordination. We're also taking advantage of some of the other existing, the home-based community services network, provider network, and we've been working with them too, and she's a part of our project team to see if there's opportunities for interoperability there. So we really, we've kind of stepped back, but we've moved forward quite a bit with just creating these opportunities for these agencies to come together and really talk through these things, and hopefully we'll realize ARC's regional vision and our regional vision of having this interoperability network.
So I'm going to step back and ask this question because I was there at the early days of GTFS and actually getting transit agencies to adopt GTFS after TriMet rolled it out. And in fact, the WalkScore guys came up with this website called Transit Go Round, and it was simply, is your city doing GTFS? Petition it. So that was a decade ago. Now all the talk is on GOFS, right? And so how is that different, and what's good about it? What's missing from it?
I can speak to that. We have some slides on it. Yes, we do. I also want to really emphasize that this is not per se for human service transportation or Medicare or healthcare transportation. This is for general public transportation. This is for all forms of publicly supported transportation. And that's exactly what happens in Sweden and Denmark. This standard has nothing literally to do with human service transportation. And the first implementation would not be particularly oriented towards human service transportation. And so again, that's really important because in terms of the GOFS conversation. GOFS is an attempt to create a specification that will enable trip planning applications like Move It, Transit, etc., to be able to, I wouldn't even say interoperate, I would say to be able to obtain data in a somewhat limited fashion with microtransit, but primarily TNCs and taxis, so that you could be in the transit app and say, oh, I can go from point A to point B. Here's a microtransit service that will connect me to a rail transit station. And you will actually know that there's a microtransit service there, and that transit app, in theory, could know something about the characteristics of that microtransit service, including could you get a trip in 20 or 30 minutes. There are many elements of what the TDS that are not included in GOFS. It is not a substitute for the TDS because it has a very specific purpose to enable a trip planning application to be able to interoperate in a limited fashion with one at a time microtransit TNC services. It is not designed to do anything holistic, such as was done with Flex Denmark. It's a step in the right direction. The technology it uses is quite different than the technology that we would use for enabling the TDS. Can you go to the, you can see the points up there. I don't have to reread them. Go to the next slide. Oh, you never got, you didn't. No, you never, you did. Oh, shoot. I was just going to say, there a deep link is used to communicate from the transit app. And I could show you what a deep link has. We thought we got the slide.
We had it there somewhere.
We thought we had it on the slideshow. Unfortunately,
Long string of gobbledygook.
can you have it? Do you have a printout? No. A deep link would take up half the screen oftentimes. It's not something that one uses routinely to communicate data in the way that a Flex Denmark does. It's basically something that takes you from website A, app A, to website B, app B. It can have 1 million parameters, and will for complicated data sets. It's a one-way communication too. There's nothing coming back the other direction, which is fine. If you want to book a trip on a microtransit service, I just send the parameters. I want to go on this trip, and it tries to book the trip. And if it books the trip, already sort of in the transit website, you'll see what happened. It's great for certain things. It's not a substitute for TDS. There it is. There it is. There's a deep link. That's a Google Flights deep link. Google has the technical resources and the money to do this. They've created deep links into probably 50 airline websites. I don't know how many of you ever use Google Flights. You can go from directly into the booking platform of American Airlines with all your flight information. But guess what? It doesn't know that you are a member of whatever American Airlines' frequent flyer program is, or your status or anything like that, because you're in one world. It's not sharing a lot of information. And that's a big limitation with this whole architecture. This is an architecture that's designed to support trip planning applications, which is great. But it's not a real substitute for what we need to do to create a Flex Denmark type of services in the United States.
All right, so we're at Junction 9. I want to throw a question at you guys. Do you want to try to do a workshop, or you want to do Q&A? Q&A. Okay, those who want a workshop, we'll bring you to the next room. I'm just kidding. So we're just gonna do Q&A because this is very exciting stuff and interesting stuff, particularly with the, building it out of a Google Sheet, right? And that, I thought it was an Excel file, but now it's a Google Sheet, and so now you can make active connections. And the excitement of 550 small providers actually exchanging schedules. If you work in government and someone presents it to you, this is probably going to be a big company, and they're going to deal with a cloud account and all kinds of very big procurement, and now you have to convince all the agencies to procure the same thing. So very interesting.
Can you back up and show Jana or someone go back? The one that has sort of the API thing.
Oh, is it like mine?
No, mine. Yeah.
All right.
So she'll get there. Those two slides, by the way, we have a proposal in to FTA now with NeoRide.
Your mic, please.
In Ohio, and we have a proposal in the FTA now from NeoRide in Ohio to actually implement the TDS in some operations in Ohio. As you may know, NeoRide is sort of a consortium of 20 transit agencies, mostly in Ohio, but also next door in Michigan and Kentucky. And this would start with 2 or 3 of them to provide interoperability among the demand responsive services that are in their service district. And if it obviously works in 2 or 3 of them, then there may be other opportunities for it. But we need money from the feds.
All right, open for questions. Raise your hand and speak. Open back. And just as a reminder, a question ends with a question mark and kind of a rising tone. So, go ahead. Okay. Can you tell us your name and your organization?
I'm going to be Vanna, running mics.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, so it's going to be kind of a silly question, but so I'm kind of new to the transportation space over the last few years. But when I was younger, looking at and hearing about government and stuff, I heard of Department of Transportation, then eventually you hear about these other organizations as you get into this space. So when we look at Denmark, who is like the group that's managing this system? As a kid, when I heard about the Department of Transportation, I was thinking, like, shouldn't they be the ones that have, like, an actual operations team that's managing the data and doing all this stuff? Like, I know we're all here trying to problem solve this, but we also have, like, the Council of Governments and all these other groups. Like, why is it so complicated? Why can't we
saying you want to live in Singapore? That's basically what you're saying.
What?
So let me answer part A of that. So who's managing this system is a publicly owned company, a publicly owned IT company called Flex Denmark. Why is it difficult? I'm going to let others here talk to that.
Well,
grab that mic.
Well, the other thing that's important about that is that the country's broken up. Getting to your point, is like into 6 public transport authorities, regionalized. And Flex Denmark started in the northernmost part of Denmark with 1 public transport authority. And very interestingly, I met the guy who was was one of the starters, and he said, the business model of us for Flex Denmark was, I was given a charter to help create this first thing, and I said, well, gee, how much budget did they give you? And he said, basically none. I had to go out and persuade the agencies in the area to be part of this, and they would pay for the privilege of being part of it. So market forces were actually being unleashed to a certain extent, but that meant that the agency had to create value. It wasn't just a public agency that sat there and took someone else's money and used it, but more or less potentially in different performance, they had to perform. And then that's how it sort of spread from this region to the next region. And pretty soon, all the regions were part of it. And this was, before, as that process unfolded, this is where this private entity, the Flex Denmark technology company, it doesn't have that name, was created. So very smart use of public resources, but in a model that incentivized performance by all the players.
And someone who was entrepreneurial in government acting out to move that. All right, next question. Yes, ma'am, over here in front.
Thank you. The Flex Denmark is very, I'm Hua Cai from Purdue University. The idea of the Flex Denmark is very exciting, and I'm curious to learn a little bit more on how it works. Do the platform, the IT company actually assign the ride to a specific company, or does the company have a say to say, oh, I accept this ride or not? And if they directly being assigned a trip, if multiple operators have the capacity to do it, who do you assign it to, and how do you ensure like equality in that?
Well, again, great questions. And if we had, an afternoon here, I bet we could sit down in this room and figure out the best way to solve that very problem. And that is what the people who were involved in creating Flex Denmark did. So here, I assign you a trip, and you decide to turn it down. Well, guess what? If you turn down more than X trips in a certain period of time, you go to the bottom of the queue in terms of, getting the next set of trips. Yeah. Right. So, of course, some trips you won't have the capacity because they're using non-dedicated vehicles for the most part. So you may have conflicts. So you've got 10 vehicles. The full capacity of 10 isn't available because you're using them for a taxi or taking kids to school with, sort of small
students come through that program.
Vehicles. So they have a diverse fleet. Flex Denmark knows what each company has to expect. I mean, all this.
A lot of the programs that have wait list.
Yeah.
There you go.
But it came from the whole country, the PTAs in each region. That's not that big when you think about that. How much is the budget in one mid-sized city for transit in the United States?
The other, just to add to that, is you can imagine is that we have health insurance companies who might be willing to pay for that ride and cover it. Of course, getting health insurance companies to pay anything is a whole together different matter. There was also a conversation I had before with someone who's proposing government agencies should be ride brokers, where they receive the request for the ride and then they bid it out to the provider, that you could do in very fast real time, saying, I can take that ride for $20, and operator B will say, I can take it for $18, right? And if you break that down further in a TNC basis, which is scary for the TNCs, maybe the driver can say, I'll take that if you pay me this, right? And then they can work this. So, but these are scenarios. Okay, more questions.
So I just want to add a little bit more on the Flex Denmark system, is that on an annual basis, Flex Denmark will negotiate contracts with providers, and each of those providers will say how available, and to what extent, times of day, number of vehicles. So they do have a pool of dedicated vehicles that they can pull upon, and they will do different contract rates depending on whether they're using dedicated vehicles or whether they're more flexible on the part of the providers.
Right. So actually, there's just like a price list. So the scheduling logic is looking at the price list in terms of some of its scheduling decisions, and we're going to use the lowest price, most appropriate provider until we reach our limit as to how much we've used them, and then we move on. So they've created all these incentives. They've used the market system really beautifully, yet it's driven by public goals.
Okay.
And those public goals are baked into some of the quality service quality measures that they require from each of these providers. So on-time performance is within 15 minutes of the scheduled time of pickup and never before. And so if you're not making, as a provider, that on-time performance, again, the algorithm's going to send you down to the bottom of the list.
All right. Question over here.
Kelly Gregory, also with Toyota. In a previous life, I worked in Denver in mobility management. We were talking about these shared ride concepts some 10 years ago or so, and a lot of providers were very cautious about, you're going to schedule something on my system, like that makes me really nervous. How am I going to accept? To bridge off of the last question. In the NeoRide example that you brought up in Ohio with extending across, large communities, how did they build consensus or address some of those conversations? Did they just build one provider, like a few providers at a time, and kind of use the data and testimonies to alleviate some of that stress?
Right. And remember, it's still a proposal, but it's sort of like you're saying. I mean, they've got two agencies that want to be able to go cross jurisdiction. And these agencies are the ones that want to try this thing out at the beginning. So no one coerced them into doing it. They said, wait a minute, I've got, here's this service A, it's vendor A's software, service B, vendor B's software, no interoperability. So let's get interoperability so these organizations can share resources. It's pretty simple. It'll be great if the feds fund this thing. Who knows?
I'll add one thing, and then Tanvir. So one of the reasons this has been hard in Atlanta, at least our initial attempt at it, is just the eligibility criteria is so much different between agencies, or their service area boundaries, or their level of community engagement, and all that plays a role. So in this case, creating choice or options, I think, could help alleviate that. But also, this is kind of beyond the TDS, but standardizing that, that level of service, and I think that would really pave the way for something like this to happen. Tanvir, why don't?
Thanks. Tanvir with Spare. So it's a good segue, actually. My question was, what is the interest among agencies for this, right? Because obviously in Atlanta, we are trying to pitch it, and there was some, the operational side was challenging and so on. So what is the general interest in agencies in US in general for something like this?
Maybe Kevin may have an answer.
Do you want to answer that question from the audience? Yeah. I know you run a transit agency, right?
Well, John Lancaster with Memphis Area Transit Authority in Memphis. Working through our 5310 program years back, all the coordinated human services planning. We've done all the planning. We did the thing for the one call, one click. Our Innovate Memphis, we've got that set up. So we've been talking about what are the next steps. And of course, in Memphis, we work with rural transportation providers. All the regional hospitals are located in Memphis, so we have a lot of rural communities. And again, those rural providers have to come 80, 90 miles. They bring their people, the Veterans Administration, et cetera. So I think we're kind of that next step. So I guess our question is, how do we take the next step and really implement this and set up this standard? And maybe we start with the sheets, but and us too, as MATA, our goal is to be the mobility regional provider for transportation. And to me, this is all a fit. We're doing the next generation fare system for payments. So how do we integrate? I mean, that's where we're at.
So to go back to your question as to what's the motivation for agencies to do this, your motivation is what exactly?
Again, I think that goal to be the regional provider, but we also want to partner with there's other providers that have vans, other authorities. We don't want to do all of it, but I think for us to be kind of control the data standard, to have that open data source, and if we've got the tool that everybody can connect to, I think that's kind of what we see as our role being. And two, we have a fleet of vehicles, but we need to supplement them, and I think that's.
So I think one thing that's worth pointing out is like these schemes for brokering rides, assigning rides to different providers. This is not new. This has been around for a long time, but it's been around inside the bubble of proprietary or highly manual systems, right? So non-emergency medical transportation is almost everywhere across the country a brokered system. and you have the central system, and then you have all these small, or mom and pop providers that are doing it, and they're doing this basically like copy paste type operations to get things into their local systems, right? So, this already exists. It's a question of whether we want it to exist at a broader scale and whether we want it to be efficient and more effective. And so this is the possibility for doing that. I mean, I know anecdotally, I just heard from a colleague who, that within the NA2 world, they're just trying to get away from CSV files, comma-separated text files for exchanging this, which is basically the world that a lot of them live in. So I think the desire is there. I think we just have, we're sort of an industry that has been sort of across decades really technically neglected and marginalized and balkanized, right? And so I think any kind of like attempt to rationalize that system and to streamline it will arrive at this. So the need is there.
Yeah, it's interesting that I don't know the person from Spare, but Spare brought up what's sort of a common objection from technology companies. Well, gee, how big a deal is this? How important is it? Why should we spend the money to do anything? Rational question, rational attitude. Because the public sector has really not gotten its act together to do something like this. And you see an architecture up there for how this could work. Basically, the TDS has to be in an API, probably hosted somewhere out in the cloud, that if you want to interoperate with somebody else, you have to have an API, an extension to your API, which most of the technology companies would have their own APIs, that then talks TDS language. They send the trip to the middleware, basically, which basically does the validation of the messages. You don't have to have the one in the middle, but it might facilitate things. And it goes to another provider, which also has a TDS compliant API. But you need to get buy-in from enough organizations, whether you're in a state or a region, that you will insist that you won't do business with them unless they have some sort of approach like this. So in sort of a way, it's up to the public sector, because if you have a vendor that doesn't want to do it, find someone that does. So
let me bring in the healthcare and the private sector a little bit. As I recall, I think that Flex Denmark vehicles have tablets where you can GPS and timestamp. Yeah. And where that's important is that you're at Round Trip, Ride Health, there's several others, are getting business from MCOs and Medicare Advantage to pay for rides, and they want to make sure the person got there in time. Oh, yeah. So that can all feed in. Of course, they're interested in effectiveness, that the person got there in time. They don't care about the efficiency. How do you balance that out in the medium? Because they don't care if you shared rides or not, but it's on the platform's interest that people share rides.
Well, Flex Denmark cares because they're trying to get the most cost-effective services. So if you don't share rides, if everything's a taxi service, but all their payers pay more money, well, if I'm a payer that's paying more money, that's bad. They have a board of directors. This is really an economic model, not just a technology model.
And I guess I would just add that the system, the behind-the-scenes system, is smart enough to know what portion of the trip is in shared ride. And so if a person travels 3/4 a mile alone and 1/4 a mile in a shared trip, or let's say there's 4 other people in that van, it's going to calculate that accordingly. And one of the things that Flex Denmark makes as one of its top priorities is a very, very clear cost accounting system, because they don't ever want to be in a position where any of their funding agencies feel like they've paid more than their fair share. And so they put a lot of effort into making sure the system works and does those calculations properly.
All right, my time signature is telling me we're at time. How many more minutes?
And I want one announcement.
Okay.
So my announcement is I have 12 copies of my paper on modernizing demand responsive transportation. In that is a 6-page summary of Flex Denmark. So I'm going to put this on the back chair, and you guys can fight over it. But the paper is available at aarp.org/future of transportation. Look for modernizing demand responsive transportation. Benji, all yours.
And with that, we'll close. Thank you so much to our panelists.